going to talk to you about big history, environmental history, and Australian history. I'm going to take you from the ice to the dust, from the white crystal desert to the red heart. I'm going to take you from Antarctica across that Southern Ocean to Australia in both directions. I'm very fortunate to have voyaged twice to Antarctica. First to write a book, a history of Antarctica called Slicing the Silence, and the second time was on a pilgrimage to this place, to Mawsons Hut in Commonwealth Bay in East Antarctica, the site of the first Australasian expedition to Antarctica from 1911 to 14. And I'm very pleased to have an old shipmate in the audience. Will Stephan, who you'll hear from tomorrow, was also on board this ship. We were both privileged to be invited as part of an Australian government pilgrimage to Mawsons Hut to commemorate that centenary. And of course, remember, Australia claims 42% of the great Antarctic continent. And we, of course, took opportunity when we were parked in the sea ice to build the number 100 out of the ice, and the Adelie penguins very kindly stood guard. And being Adelie penguins, they couldn't resist, could they? They couldn't resist slipping through the zeros. They're so much fun. So we photographed them, we interviewed them for my Penguin History of Antarctica, and they were just an inspiration to us. And of course, Mawsons' exploits were part of that heroic era of Antarctic history at the beginning of the 20th century, when there was that race to the pole. And here we have Robert Falcon Scott, the British party, arriving second at the South Pole and finding the Norwegians had forestalled them. There they are, looking glumly at Amundsen's tent, and Scott's party tragically died and perished on that return journey. Surely part of the reason was their disappointment after so much trial. So Mawson had his own exploits, his own heroic exploits. You'll know, many of you, I think, the story of his own sledging journey where he lost his two companions, Belgrave Ninnis and Xavier Mertz, and struggled home alone over 100 miles, only to find on his arrival back at the windiest place on the planet that the ship was steaming north for another year. There were companions remained behind to stay with him and look after him. And there are those companions who were down there together. They were mostly Australian, mostly in their 20s, and mostly university educated, and they were down there to do science. In spite of the emphasis that you always see about the great heroic adventures, what marked Mawson out was his real devotion to science. And of course, Scott did want to get Mawson on his polar party, but Mawson refused that opportunity, established his own expedition, and he wanted to explore. He wanted to see new territory. He didn't want to retrace the path of Scott and Shackleton to the South Pole, which was relatively well known. He wanted to find new territory. He was drawn to the windiest place on the planet, as we now know, at sea level. The windiest place on the planet is exactly where Mawson established his base, because of those katabatic winds roaring down from the great high Antarctic plateau. But Mawson was attracted to Antarctica because he had seen the signs of ice ages, ancient ice ages, in the rocks of the Australian earth, particularly around Flinders Ranges in his own South Australian backyard. And he wanted to see an ice age in action. As a geologist, he wanted to see an ice age in action. He wanted to see where 90% of the world's land ice is to be found. Of course, he didn't know there was quite that much ice down there then. We've learnt so much since his time about what is to be found down there on that great continental ice cap. Now, our own voyage, a century later, was also a scientific voyage. It was a pilgrimage, but it was a marine science voyage. We had to voyage our way around iceberg B9b, which you can see in the background there. They always have these names now. And another iceberg that had fallen off the Ross Ice Shelf, bulldozed the tongue of the Mertz Glacier and exposed parts of the sea floor that had never been available for observation before. Our ship was lowering these sorts of instruments into the water, constantly measuring temperature, salinity, oxygen, carbon and nutrients and so forth. And exactly what Jan was mentioning, they've observed over many decades that the Antarctic waters, the Antarctic bottom water as it's called, has become less salty and less dense, and it's because of this inflow of glacial meltwater, and surely it could have an impact on ocean circulations. It's a crucial question. And in trying to understand what this data means, of course, the history was crucial. We were visiting collecting stations that Mawson had visited 100 years earlier. So the history and the science went hand in hand. History is not just the storytelling, it's absolutely integrated with understanding and working together with the science. So Mawson's centenary, and let's just admire Frank Hurley's beautiful photograph of an iceberg from that expedition. Mawson's centenary made us think about how much we have learned about ice in the last century. Antarctic voyagers and explorers like Scott of the late 19th and early 20th century had originally wanted rock, like Jan. You know, they wanted to have rock to properly study and soil that they could plant a flag in and claim for their country. The ice was sort of in the way, really. It was a nuisance, an obstacle. And later, of course, the ice becomes a testing ground for this heroism. It becomes a testing ground for physical endeavour, a source of beauty and fear, but still essentially an obstruction, stopping them from reaching that land underneath. But by the mid-20th century, it changes. The ice itself becomes a primary scientific object of interest. And it's no longer just an obscuring and frustrating barrier. It's actually a mineral of interest in itself, and scientists began to see glaciers as geological and Antarctica as a vestigial landscape, a giant white fossil clamped there on the base of the globe. And in the early 1950s, it was discovered that the ice sheets were not just a few hundred metres thick, but actually kilometres deep. And so the driest of all continents was actually a vast, elevated plateau of frozen water. That was a stunning insight in the mid-20th century. It revealed that what we know today, that the sea level is principally controlled by the state of the Antarctic ice sheet. And so questions about the ice in the last century have changed from how frustrating to how vast, how continental, how deep, how old, and now how stable. So we watch changes in the ice cap with anxiety. And the confirmation of global warming due to human influence came not only from the behaviour of the ice sheets, of course, but also from those air bubbles trapped within it. Because before Antarctica was even seen by humans, it was already recording our impact. So if 100 years ago the defining Antarctic journey was the sledging expedition across the surface of the ice, and 50 years ago it was the tractor traverse that with seismic soundings was measuring the volume of the ice sheet, then the defining Antarctic journey of our own time is straight down, with the help of a drill, from the top of the ice dome to the continental bedrock. A vertical journey back through time. And the ice core thus extracted enables us to see our civilization in the humbling context of hundreds of thousands of years of climate history. So right now in Antarctica, the international race is on again. Not for the South Pole, not for the first transantarctic traverse, but for the first million-year ice core. Now, Antarctic ice cores have, as you know, been crucial to our understanding of the place of humans on Earth in Earth history. And the cyclical ice ages of the last few million years, the Pleistocene, were probably a significant driving factor in the evolution of modern humans. And that very stable climate of the Holocene has seen, as we know, the rising complexity of human civilizations. And now the Anthropocene heralds this new era in which both ice and humans will be massively destabilised. So ice, I guess this is my message, ice may seem to be abiotic and inhuman, but it is bound up with our fate, and our fate is bound up with its. So it's ice that generated the sense of urgency that we now feel about the climate crisis, because ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica revealed that dramatic swings in global temperature had occurred in the past. Dramatic, sudden. And it showed that the Earth's system is sensitive, it's delicate. I do think that ice cores are the holy scripts, the sacred scrolls of our age. Now, the Cold War, that noted, and I have to say, Antarctic historians love talking about the Cold War in Antarctica. The Cold War was a noted stimulant to science, and it generated two revolutionary images of life on Earth. One you've already seen. It's a beautiful, famous one. It's that Earthrise that David showed us. View of Earth, the blue planet, whole, beautiful, vulnerable, contingent, finite and lonely. That image that comes from the Apollo program. Now, the other image is this, which Jan has shown you. And I don't want you to read the graph, I just want you to look at it as an image. And Jan described it very well. There are those charts of CO2 and temperature rises going in lockstep over hundreds of thousands of years. This comes from the Vostok ice core, high on the dome of the Antarctic plateau. And Will Steffen has described this steady sawtooth graph as Earth's heartbeat and observes that it's now going off the chart. So those two images, the Earth rise and the Earth's heartbeat, I think are images of the Anthropocene. They are perspectives in deep space and deep time. Now, even though we feel that urgency and fear about the climate crisis, we know that climate denialism remains a part of our society. It's a part of the reality we live with and struggle with. I'm interested in it. We all should be interested in it. These are our fellow humans. Of course, much of climate denialism is boring, actually, because it's just, when you scratch the surface, you find that it's just funded by the fossil fuel industry for short-term profit. I'm more interested in that other kind of denialism to which we are all subject. It is that doubt is not only the product of these industries protecting their livelihoods, but rather it's also, I think, the natural refuge of humans confronting an unwelcome, in fact, terrifying reality. And we're all prone, I think, to this willing blindness and comforting self-delusion. Overcoming that is our greatest challenge. Events such as this conference, I think, are aimed at heightening the consciousness even of those here who already are concerned. We need to have that conversation going. We all need to be more alert and have our consciousness raised about what we are living through. And emotional denialism can take many forms: avoidance, hope, anxiety, even a kind of torpor, I think, when people finally get it and realise what is going to be the predicament for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. This is an interesting study, Living in Denial by Kari Marie Norgaard. It's a study came out in 2011 of an environmentally conscious Norwegian community. It's a community which has a high acceptance of climate science and a strong political commitment to doing something about it. Yet, she describes them as living in denial, because what she observed as an anthropologist and sociologist was a failure to integrate that knowledge into their everyday actions. Now, this is our predicament, isn't it? What we know and what we do, and how to bring them together in some kind of meaningful, real and practical alliance. She noted people living in a parallel emotional universe where climate change was both deeply disturbing and almost completely submerged in public discussions. It's unimaginable in many ways what we are confronting. And I think that's another important contribution to this conference. It's to enable us to imagine the future and to do that we're going to have to learn from the past and the deep past. So this is a cultural challenge that we face as much as a scientific one, and this conference recognises that with its attention to economy and law and governance and education and health and so on. And my discipline of history, I think, has much to contribute to all these areas of policy and understanding. And history is also important in explaining and understanding the nature of the climate science and climate change itself, and its relations between climate and society over time. This is a crucial area for research in my discipline. We need the fine-grained documentary analysis, century-scale change that historians bring alongside the deeper data and long-term scientific information. And denialists and skeptics will often say that the climate predictions are all based on future modelling. Well, that's of course not true, because they're also crucially based on past experience and on historical archives, both ancient and recent. We need the hundreds and thousands of years from the Vostok ice core and also the documentary record from human history, particularly, I like to say, about the last 1,000 years of human history. And, you know, a fine-grained history of the last 1,000 years reveals the way in which social changes happen in response to changes in average global temperatures of about 1 degree Celsius. We know, for example, in the medieval warm period from 900 to 1300 that Norwegian farmers grew wheat in the north of their country, English winemakers planted grapes in Herefordshire, there's a burst of cathedral building across medieval Europe. Norse Vikings, of course, famously settled Iceland and then colonised Greenland, sailed west even to North America. Inca civilization rose to prominence in the high Andes. Polynesian voyaging in the Pacific brought people to New Zealand. Now, these kinds of dramatic changes are not all due to climatic variations, of course, but what we now are more alert to is the way in which climate changes of about up to 1 degree Celsius in average global temperatures were a factor. And so from 1300, the Little Ice Age, as we came to call it, which lasted through to the mid-19th century, took hold. And colder temperatures and extremes began. There were outbreaks of the Black Death, of bubonic plague beginning in the mid-14th century. Harsh winters and poor harvests made people vulnerable and disease more prevalent and virulent. And here you're looking at an image of Peter Bruegel the Elder from the 1560s called Hunters in the Snow, and this one is another of his images from the same period called The Triumph of Death. Dutch canals froze over, shipping couldn't leave port, Londoners skated on the Thames, glaciers in the Swiss Alps overwhelmed mountain villages, bishops prayed at the feet of advancing glaciers. Perhaps a third of the population of the world died in the 17th century because of these travails. Climate, again, wasn't the only governing factor, but it's a crucial factor. And these average global temperature fluctuations were less than those that we now face. So I think the important sort of public education point here is to help understand, people to understand why 1 degree variation in average global temperatures, or 2 degrees, which is what we're talking about in Paris right now, why that can be cataclysmic. We know it can. History shows us that it can have very dramatic effects. It's because of those feedback loops. You know, extreme weather destroyed crops, which led to famine. Heavy rain allowed rodents to multiply. They ate stored food, spread disease. Famine created unrest and war increased suffering and spread disease. That's a feedback loop that amplifies the effect of prolonged adverse weather. Climate, disease, and war are the unholy trinity that we can recognise in the last 1,000 years of history. And historians have been working at this for a while now. In the 1960s, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, the great French historian, was a pioneer of climate history over 1,000 years. And more recently, this important book, I think, by Geoffrey Parker about the global crisis of the 17th century war, climate change and catastrophe. He makes those links between social, political and environmental history, helping us to understand what a difference a degree makes. So I'd now like to reflect as I finish upon the way in which historians have embraced the longer-term perspective of history. History really is a product of, as a professional discipline, of the 19th century. It's a servant, if you like, of the nation-state. Nations are a relatively novel phenomenon in human history, and history as a discipline really defined itself in working on the sorts of archives that nation-states generated. And so in some ways, history set itself at first against a long-term environmental view, against an understanding of humanity as integrated with nature. Let me give you this example. Perhaps the most influential philosopher of history in the early 20th century was R.G. Collingwood, and a very fine philosopher and historian, and ancient historian. And he wrote, though, that the last true thing that can be said about a man is that he is a product of nature. He also said, the historian is not interested in the fact that men eat and sleep and make love and thus satisfy their natural appetites. Historians aren't interested in natural things. We're interested in that cultural artefact that history saw itself as focusing on. These things that he described were outside history. Well, things have changed for various reasons. Of course, there was that great revolution in historical understanding that came about in the 19th century with the discovery of the deep past of the Earth. Charles Lyell and Comte de Buffon and many others, but also Charles Darwin with his great evolutionary insights. And in the early 20th century, with the revolution in 20th century physics, with that discovery that cosmology itself is historical, that, as David Christian has put it, history is not an attribute of human society alone, but the Earth itself, life on Earth, and even the universe have histories. And one of the writers who implemented that vision for us was H.G. Wells, that great British polymath, short history of the world. I'm pleased to see it's a penguin history. He tried to bring that perspective, that biophysical perspective, to human history. And another important thinker in this area, in my field of history, is Fernand Braudel, the French historian. His great work is The Mediterranean, which is a multi-volume, detailed history of that region, but in which presents a distinctive argument about history. You know, he was imprisoned during the Second World War. He wrote much of the Mediterranean, his great history, while a captive, and he, in the post-war period, reeled from the horrors of the Second World War. He reacted against the dominance of political history and the short time span. He thought this was part of what had created the horror that he was inhabiting. And he championed la longue durée. He wanted to see historians working across much longer time spans. He said, can there be any humanism at the present time? And he's writing in 1946, can there be any humanism at the present time without an ambitious history, conscious of its duties and its great powers? You can hear his passion. His own experience of wartime captivity then propelled him into this sort of, to seek an escape from the grim immediacy of the history of events and to reject the short time span itself, a sort of imprisonment. So he participated in that great and urgent post-war search for a history to live by, one that found human commonality beyond the categories of nation or race, and one that pushed history back into prehistory. And I think we see that idea going on now in the late 20th and early 21st century. We see it in the work of people like John McNeill, William McNeill, Alfred Crosby, American historians, another American historian here, Daniel Lord Smale, who's combined archaeology, anthropology and history in long millennia views of the human past. And of course, we know it through the outstanding work of David Christian, who's been such a fabulous advocate for this perspective, and who himself, I think, is, of course, inspired by the cosmological revolution, is inspired by the evolutionary epic, but also, too, by the horrors of war. I mean, David's spoken about growing up at a time when the Cuban Missile Crisis was there to remind us of how delicate and dangerous the nuclear situation was and is, as he's reminded us again today. So I think this is part of what drives us all, I think, to seek this longer-term big history picture. And surely it's important to remember that David is an Australian historian too. And you can't live in Australia in this time without being very conscious of our own peculiar relationship with deep time. We have lived through a revolution in time, much greater than anywhere else in the world. The timeless land was actually forged in a time revolution. In the 200 years following the European invasion of Australia, the known age of the Earth increased from 6,000 years to 4.6 billion. And let's just contemplate. Here's a fossil imprint for you, Jan, and a footprint. It's a human footprint from Lake Mungo from over 20,000 years ago. We have, in the second half of the 20th century, as Australians, we have discovered that the timescale, the human timescale of our continent, has increased tenfold in 30 years. And of course, now we look back not just to a few thousand years of human history here, but to tens of thousands, to 50 or 60,000 years of human history in this place. And this must affect the way we see not just our own history, but world history. And it gives us a very special, I think, perspective and contribution to offer the world about the Anthropocene and about Australia's place in the global story. This is no longer the land patronised by the first colonists as being a land of contrarieties, an upside-down land. It's now, in fact, we have different ways of speaking of this. It has a Gondwanan genesis. It's an ancient craton. It's a low-energy ecosystem with a boom and bust ecology. We've transformed the way we talk about this place. And instead of a kind of embarrassment about the footnote to the British imperial story, we have, I think, a much more confident Australian story, which is very much based on a growing understanding of the great and distinctive contribution of Indigenous people in this place. The first Australians are now recognised as humanity's pioneer sea voyagers, and Aboriginal society as innovative and ancient and adaptive. And all these insights are new. They've all evolved and emerged since I was in primary school. And we have to keep asserting this southern perspective to the global narratives, because sometimes they forget about us. That transatlantic hegemony of the Northern Hemisphere sometimes overlooks the Australian story, and sometimes they present us with a relentlessly northern and icy version of the Pleistocene, when the great ice sheets eradicated life and civilization didn't commence until after the great thaw began 12,000 years ago. And Daniel Smale, whose books I just showed you and who I admire, nevertheless has two assumptions that Australian scholars would argue with. He suggests that civilization is a term associated with agriculture, and he suggests 50,000 years as a possible horizon for modern humanity. Now, both of those assumptions, I think, are shattered by an understanding of Aboriginal Australia. And so when we look at that Aboriginal story, we see people who are not just struggling with, well, if not in the ice, they're in the dust of the ice ages, and they're dealing with temperature changes of 5 degrees Celsius and more, such as those we might also face. So an Australian history of the world includes the experience of people surviving cold droughts in the Central Australian deserts and sustaining human civilization in the face of massive sea level rises and temperature change. So we need to remember what our place enables us to say about this bigger story. And I'll like to finish by mentioning the work of Mike Smith, a great Australian archaeologist who represents, I think, the great contribution of archaeology to the Australian story. And Mike has worked in this, that's his book, The Archaeology of Australia's Desert. What is impressive about it is it works into that deep archaeological past, but it also has a detailed history of the last millennium. And what you discover is that many of the things that settlers and colonists thought were timeless and archaic and fossilised in Aboriginal cultural ritual are in fact seem to be the product of rapid and dynamic changes happening in society over the last 1,000 years. Many of those things observed and seen to be timeless were in fact new and novel and dynamic and adaptive. So we have just begun a fascinating and long journey into understanding our continent in very different ways. And so to think on where we've come, from the ice to the dust, at the beginning of this event, Andrew and the VC acknowledged country, and it's not just a token thing, that's a very important ritual. It's a courtesy, but it also is enacting what we know to be true, which is that all history in this land is Indigenous history in some way. And Mike's work is an example of how an archaeologist who working on deep past, but also constantly with Aboriginal people who own that land today and live on it today. And that travelling from the ice to the dust reminds us that the challenge for us is to integrate, as David has challenged us to integrate across a whole range of different timescales, to work not just in recent history, but on the long-term evolution of humanity as a species, and that the Australian story has a very distinctive contribution to make to that view of the history of Earth. Thank you.